Okay, welcome everybody to the Social Science Data Lab in the room as well as online. So we're streaming this talk, so if you have some issues with privacy, you're warned, and you will only be recorded regarding the sound and what you're saying. So if you're hesitant to be recorded and eventually ending up on YouTube with your sound with the questions, so you can use the chat, for instance, or restrict yourself to watching and listening. I'm very happy to welcome Ruben Bach for this talk, who's presenting his work on weblogs and smartphone records for social research. He's working at the University of Mannheim as a postdoc at the Chair of Statistics and Methodology, as well as at the Collaborative Research Center Political Economy of Reforms. He's done his PhD in the Statistical Methods Department at the Institute for Employment Research, and his research interests are in big data. So, for instance, digital trace data, what we are learning today, social media data, machine learning in survey research, as well as survey methodology. So we're very happy to have you here. Please note that the live stream link has changed. This one is the correct one, and we will post this talk later, so you can rewatch it and yeah, enjoy it. Ruben, it's good.
Thank you very much, Julian, and thanks also to Dennis, who is not here today, but I think online. So thank you very much, Dennis. As announced in the program, I will talk about using weblog data and smartphone data for social research. And just to give you a very brief outline of what I will talk about today, I will first talk a little bit about what are weblogs, what is smartphone data, or what do I think of when I talk about smartphone data in this talk. I will talk about a few empirical applications, so how can we use weblog data, smartphone data for social research, and then I will talk a little bit about ongoing projects that we currently have at the chair with colleagues, and then I will also highlight some potentials for future research where I think there's room for new projects and some ideas we have. And also I invite you, if you have ideas or if you want to collaborate, we have data available that can be used. I will talk about this at towards the end of this talk. And as a short note at the very beginning, so previously I think talks in this data and methods lab were mostly about methods or tools, but this talk is rather about data. So new forms of data, or data that are new to social scientists or have been only relatively recently been introduced to the social science world. So I won't talk about methods, I will rather talk about data and what we can do with this novel data. So if you follow all this big data debate and computational social science and new sources of data, of digital trace data for social sciences and for social research, you've probably seen that Twitter is among the most popular ones, especially in political science, where people scrape tweets of politicians and then try to infer their stance towards certain topics or their political orientations, and whether they, for example, can predict election outcomes, or they use Twitter to study political polarization. And likewise, we've seen that Facebook data is used for social research, for example, to estimate personality attributes and political views in a highly debated paper that would then also go on and trigger some research that was rather highly debated. And two new, at least in my understanding, in my perception, two very recent new forms of data are weblogs and search queries. And here, as you can see, I will talk about weblogs and search queries. And I've already written down two exemplary papers that use weblog data to measure partisan polarization and political news consumption. So weblog data, most of the examples that I've seen in the literature so far come from political science, political communication, voting behavior, and polarization in the media. And another one that I would like to highlight here is search query data. I don't know if you've seen this book by Steven Davidowitz. It's called Everybody Lies, and then some other title. And it is about how search query data, that is data that is generated by people typing words into search engines, can tell us something about social phenomena and about behaviors and underlying attitudes of the people who go online to search information. And he argues that these data can help us answer new questions that we couldn't answer before, or allow us to get more precise estimates of things we couldn't study so well with, for example, survey data. And one paper that started all this search query research by Steven Davidowitz is about racial animus in the US presidential election. So he used a lot of search data and search queries that people who go on Google and search about politics and the 2008 and 2012 election of Obama, how these data can tell us something about racial attitudes in the US. Again, I will talk about weblogs and search queries for most of the talk. Weblogs, I will also include smartphone records. And just to give you an idea, I hope it's not too small, what weblogs or records of browsing histories look like. I've put up here an example of some mostly made-up data to give you an impression how that could look. So what we usually have when we use weblog data is we have some ID. So that just tells us, is it person 1, is it person 2, person 3? So we have some idea from which person the data was generated. And then most of the information that we want is in the URL. So we see typically full URLs, that is, we do not only see the domain. For example, the domain of the first entry would be typico.de. Instead, we see the full URL, so everything that we need to navigate to a specific website on the web. And then we also have timestamps here called used at, so we get date, hour, and even seconds, and then active seconds, which tells us how long did somebody navigate or browse on this specific URL. So, for example, the first URL is typico.de, and then some additional information, and it's about online betting. It was accessed at some time in 2017, 10:45 and 15 seconds, for a duration of 83 seconds. And so what does this tell us? Well, probably this is a person that is interested in online betting and sports betting. And just to pick another example, here, the first entry for those who are online, the first entry of ID2 is from RP Online, which is a newspaper in North Rhine-Westphalia. And here you can already see we have a lot of information. So we see the domain RP online, so it has to do something, it's news media, some journalistic output. And then we get more information. So we see, well, the article that this URL refers to is from NRW, so North Rhine-Westphalia. Then it's about a specific city, Düsseldorf, and then you see the title, or at least a short version of the title of the news article. So Airport Düsseldorf, Flughafen, airport again, not responsible for what happened there. So it tells us, well, this is an article that deals with some local topic, and it has to do with the airport in Düsseldorf. And again, we see the timestamp and the duration. And so we can already learn a lot about what somebody consumed on the web, maybe how it could influence their opinions, how it influences their knowledge, and what they did online. And another example, the second entry is from Autoscout24.de, which is a website that is a platform to sell used cars and find used cars. And here we also have a lot of information. I can't kind of decrypt it because I haven't looked into it in more detail, but I'm very sure that somebody searched for something, and here we get the results, Ergebnisse, and then we have some parameters. So the easiest probably is we see price from 0, price to 8,000. So I assume somebody searched for a car or any motor vehicle, which costs up to 8,000 euros. Then we see fuel equals B, so it's likely standard gas. And a few more information. We also get information on where this, where the location was that the search specified. So Heilbronn, we even get latitude and longitude. So we see, we can get from a URL, we can get a lot of information. And here, when we look at ID3, we see somebody visited Bild.de, so a very kind of populistic newspaper outlet, and they consume news about something happening in a foreign country, about some hurricane. Then there's another entry, Arbeitsagentur.de, meine e-services, and this, do you have any idea what this could tell us? Do you know Arbeitsagentur? Yeah, probably somebody is looking for work, somebody doesn't have a job, or somebody is looking for a new job, or wants to apply for unemployment benefits or something like that. So you can already see we get a lot of information just by looking at specific URLs. The problem, however, is that we do not only have like 20 or 30, but we have usually millions of these URLs. So we need some techniques to extract as much information as possible. And here I've printed some additional URLs just to demonstrate what we can learn, especially from the news media ones and from search queries. So the first one, Süddeutsche.de, a large German online, large German newspaper. It's about politics, and it has to do with something happening in Hanover with a right-wing extremist party, demonstration and journalists, and say if we wanted to know, for example, how much people and what kind of news they consume, especially about politics, we could say very easily, well, we filter for all those Süddeutsche entries that are followed by politics, for example. And then the next one is Amazon.de, and here, can somebody tell me what we see from this? I'll just do it. Somebody searched for mostly harmless econometrics. Then looking at Google, we see somebody searched for MSIS method spikes. So we see from the URL the search queries used. The same when you look at Bing.com, another search engine, somebody searched for University Mannheim. And there we already see, well, as with many other, just as with many other sources of textual data, we have problems with some weird encoding. So this is something we need to pay special attention to, because this is the German umlaut for A. And there's even more information in here, which I haven't understood so far, but for my research, I'm just interested in the search queries. So what I do is I extract the search queries made to a search engine. And when you look at another one, DuckDuckGo, which is a more privacy-oriented search engine, even here you see in the URL, you have the search query. So this is Wahlomat voting advice application for 2017. So this is likely for the German federal election in 2017. And then, because this talk is not only about weblogs, but also about smartphone records, I want to highlight another example. Here we see it's basically the same thing as with the URLs, but we don't have the URL. Instead of the URL, we have app names. So we see when somebody used which app and for how long. And in addition, we also have a classification of the apps. So the first one, some calendar app, which is in the category email, messaging, and telephone. Another example is we have some mail apps like GMX Mail, then a lot of WhatsApp Messenger, like it would probably show up on any of our phones. And then just to point out that this is not just about like what social messaging, etc. Here are two very interesting examples, and I can already tell you I made these up, but this is what we also see in real data. Somebody used a period tracker, which is from the category health and fitness, obviously, for 14 seconds. And after that, there was a use of an app called Pedometer, which is likely an app that has also something to do with, I don't know, tracing and recording the steps you make every day. So it tracks your health and fitness, for example. So I've highlighted a few examples and a few things that we can already, just by observing weblogs and smartphone records, what we can already learn from them. One major challenge is that when we use such weblogs and records of smartphone use, we usually cannot observe what happens inside apps. So that is one very important limitation. If somebody opens on the phone Facebook, we have no idea what happens in Facebook. If they open facebook.com in their browser on their desktop PC, then we can see it. If they open facebook.com in their mobile browser on their phone, then we can usually see it. But if they open the Facebook app and do stuff in the Facebook app, then we have usually no means to see what happens in the app. And some apps have built-in browsers. So if you open a link in Facebook on your mobile device in the Facebook app, then probably we cannot observe which websites you visit when you open them in the Facebook built-in browser. So that is a drawback. We cannot observe everything. And at least for the data that I work with, and for data that I've seen in other projects, usually there's an option that people can turn off data collection completely. Well, that's just like non-response or dropout or attrition. So they don't want to participate in our study no more, but they can also temporarily turn off data collection. Because say they want to use their online banking services, and they fear that if others like researchers can observe that that is too sensitive, so they turn it off. With the data that we use and that I've used in the past, I can already tell you that we are very sure that people do not turn off data collection very often, because we especially studied sensitive content over time. And there is a lot of adult content in there. And so we thought, well, adult content is probably pretty sensitive. We also looked at illegal video streaming and use of banking apps and banking websites. And we do not see that there's any change over time. So we thought, well, maybe at the beginning, people when they first join the data collection, they are very aware that their behavior is monitored, is recorded. So they would kind of reduce it a little bit, but then later on forget. But first of all, we see so much adult content in the data, so people don't seem to care. And second, there's hardly any change over time. So that kind of makes us confident that people do not turn off data collection very often. Okay, so before I talk about, well, how can we get the data? Because, well, I mean, it's a nice data source, but you can imagine it's pretty difficult or at first looks difficult to get such data. I will also talk about some helpful tools and skills that you probably need to analyze weblog data and records of smartphone use. So as with many other big data sources or new data sources, you need tools like text mining and natural language processing. If you recall from earlier, I showed you some examples of URLs, and there's a lot of text in there, so you need some way to automatically extract the text and then automatically learn what the text is about. Then probably you want also some web scraping skills, because say you want to study political polarization of online news media, or if say people who have populist party preferences have preferences for certain news media outlets, or get their news media mainly through social media, then you probably also want to know not only what is the title of the content they consume, but what is the actual content about. And then you also need web scraping skills. So you would, if you see there's a URL pointing to a news media article, you probably would want to scrape the content of the article in order to also analyze the content. But if you do that, you need to be careful with dynamic URLs. What do I mean with dynamic URLs? If I go to, say, Bild.de today, it will look very different from Bild.de tomorrow or Bild.de 1 year ago. So if I have historical data, then going mostly to domains, like on a very high level, like Bild.de, the content will change. So that is what I call dynamic URLs. The content constantly changes. But if I go, for example, on an article basis, like a specific news media article about some specific topic, then usually those are static, and I can, even after 2 years, still scrape the content of some news media article, for example. Then another thing you should keep in mind, you need a lot of computational resources. So just as an example, 4 months of weblog data that we analyzed from about 2,000 users resulted in about 37.5 million observations or rows. That is still about the size you can load into a, say, standard computer, but some of the operations already take much time, so maybe you want to invest into some cloud solutions like Amazon Web Services. So even if you work here at the university, you can get computational resources with more power for free. Okay, so some tools and skills you need. You already have an idea how the URLs look, so you know what to expect. And now I think probably the most interesting question is, well, how do we obtain such weblog data? I mean, it's all very nice that we can use this data and we see a lot of information from URLs. But how can we get the data? I mean, we can't just say, please, everybody in the room, give us your records of browsing histories. No, one very cheap or a relatively cheap way and the easiest way to obtain such data is to buy data from what we call access panels or non-probability panels. So maybe you've heard of YouGov.com or you've heard of Respondi.com or NetQuest. These kind of platforms, they keep a pool of participants who agree to, from time to time, answer short surveys about basically any topic that market researchers or social researchers are interested in. Whenever there's a new survey, these participants are invited. They get small remuneration for participating in the survey. And then we as researchers can collect their survey responses. And some of these access panels or non-probability panels have also implemented these additional features where some of their respondents also agreed to installing a small plugin into their browsers on their desktop computers and laptop computers, and to download a small research app onto their phones that would, on the desktop computers, track what they do in their browsers, so give us these records of URLs, and on their phones usually give us URLs visited in native browsers, so Safari on iOS devices and Chrome on Android devices, and also give us records of what people, which kind of apps they use, and just the data that I showed you. And we as researchers can buy data from these non-probability panels or access panels in order to use it for our research purposes. And ideally, and to make most of the data, we at the same time ask those people where we observe the records of browsing behavior and smartphone usage. We also ask them survey questions at the same time because, for example, we want to know, okay, what are their social demographic characteristics? Or we want to know what are their political preferences? Or we want to know, are they employed? Are they unemployed? Do they have children? Do they live in a house or do they live in a flat? And so the very nice feature is that we can combine these records of browsing behavior and app usage with additional information collected through surveys. And I don't know how much it actually costs because I wasn't involved in that, but from some offers that I've seen, it's relatively cheap to get the data. So I think for several hundred users, say 1, 2, 3 months, you may actually be able to get data for a 5-figure number. So it's not way more expensive than standard high-quality survey data. So I know of commercial vendors. I know some commercial vendors like Respondi.com, NetQuest.com, and YouGov, who operate in the countries I've written down here. So we, for example, work with data from Respondi.com, and we have data for Germany, France, and UK. But I also know that in other countries, especially in Latin American countries, in Spain, NetQuest.com is huge, and YouGov. I know they offer these services in the UK and in the US. But there seems to be way more. So this is a map of non-probability panels and providers of such data that was put together by a software company that develops the tools necessary to collect the data. So these providers, they go to what's it called, Bakupa, Bakupa, and they buy their software and then implement them for their participants. And it seems to be available for many more countries. All right. Some drawbacks of non-probability panel data. I don't know how many of you have worked with non-probability panel data in the past. One of the biggest issues is with standard survey data. We usually have we collect our data from some well-defined samples, so that we can make inferential statements, and that our typical variance estimators and everything works, and we get data that is, say, representative of the German population, for example. But with these non-probability panels, we do not have this feature. So these panels are usually open for everybody, so people can just go to the website, register, and to make some money. And usually that is, I think, what their motivation is, to earn some money. And we can adjust these, I don't want to call them samples because there's not really sampling involved, but we can adjust these pools of people by imposing some quotas. So we could say, okay, we want a quota of gender that follows the distribution of gender in Germany, and education, and age, and household size, and information like that. But the problem still is we have this bias due to self-selection into participation. And it's just like if you, like from a causal inference setting, you have this problem when you think about propensity scores, that people self-select into some treatment, and here it is, they self-select into participation in the survey, and we usually do not know whether we can achieve, like if we can make our sample really look on all observable and unobservable variables, look like a gold standard sample that is that was drawn with a well-defined sample strategy. So one of the biggest drawbacks. Another drawback is that these non-probability samples have been found to be more politically attentive and engaged on average than probability-based samples. With probability-based samples, I just mean these standard, like the JIP or the data like ISSP, ESS, and any standard survey sample. So we know there are some issues. Another big problem or challenge is that we can have professional respondents. So because these people answer so many survey questions, and they say they answer 5, 6, 7, 8 surveys per month, their response style can be very different from people who have not been answering surveys for years or months. And just some findings from the literature. One problem is that a very small number of participants is responsible for a lot of data generated through these various providers, because often people do not only register in one survey, but in many different. And so there's a study that found that about 1% of participants in the 10 largest panels in the US are responsible for 34% of all responses. Then Hilliges et al. Found that those people who answer a lot of surveys are less politically interested, engaged, and knowledgeable than other respondents. And from our own evaluations, just looking at the data, I sometimes get the impression also when I look at the records of browsing behavior, that these people are really, say, a very special group. So my impression is that a lot of them answer surveys all the time. They always look for ways, like for on these platforms, to get special deals, and there is a lot of consumption of, as I said, adult content. So this is really an issue that we need to think about. If we say want to make inferential statements, or like we want to estimate population totals, then probably using these methods is not ideal, even if you use and adjust for gold standard reference samples, for example. But if you are interested in like correlational structures and association between variables, then usually we hope that the information we gather from complex models does also hold for, even if based on these non-probability samples, also holds for more traditional samples. Okay, do you have any questions so far? No? Then I'll continue. Alternatives, so we've seen it, yeah.
So how do they provide data from these companies?
Yeah.
There's so much information in this data, do they anonymize it?
Yeah, yeah. So there are some, there are some routines to get rid of some very personal information, like from Facebook sites. Usually they remove the names that would identify people's Facebook sites. At least that is what they say they do. Sometimes it doesn't work so well, but information that really could allow you to identify individuals is usually removed. Okay, an alternative, and we've seen that in the past from some colleagues here at the University of Mannheim, who are also affiliated with the IAB. They developed their own tools and piggyback on existing probability samples. So what they did was they partnered up with a tech company. They developed their own research app, which they then sent to participants of this large labor market panel study, which is conducted by the IAB, the Labor Market and Social Security panel. And they randomly chose, like I think 50% of the panel, and randomly invited them to participate in their study of digital traces. And so they got an invitation to download an app onto their phones that would then collect not only app records and browsing behavior on mobile devices, but also, I think, geolocation, contacts in their phone books, and so many more information. It's another alternative, but I don't know the exact numbers, but I'm pretty sure this is way more expensive. But you have the advantage that you piggyback on an existing probability sample. So probably you have better data in terms of representation than from these non-probability panels. But still, I mean, the problem is if you participate in a panel survey and people ask you to download an app that kind of records everything you do on your phone, well, probably a lot of people don't participate, so you don't have this problem of self-selection into participation, but you have the problem of non-participation, and it's expensive. Okay, then I call this beyond weblogs and smartphone sensors. It is also possible to access even more information especially from smartphones. So this is a slide taken from Frauke Kreuter and Florian Keusch. They gave a presentation a few months ago about sensors that are built into modern smartphones and that we can access through research apps like the one they use in their IAB Smart project. And for example, location, well, we can get at least approximately an idea of users' location through Wi-Fi or through GPS, which will be way more precise, information from fingerprint sensors. Then we have all this accelerometer, gyroscope, pedometer sensors, which tell us a lot about physical activity. Like this is all the sensors that are also used for all these health fitness trackers and like counting steps. And when you go running with your Runtastic app, they all work with this information, maybe paired with location. Then proximity sensors. We have all these health measures like heart rate sensor. So there's way more information that we can access from phones and use for social research. And here I just put out some empirical applications that have used these very detailed records of smartphone use, including all these sensors. So one study, I think they handed out smartphones to elderly people in the US to study their everyday activities and their stress levels through these EMAs, ecological momentary assessments, I think they're called. Another study, they wanted to know how much do elderly people move in their neighborhood and how much do they interact through various locations, and they wanted to see like how predominant is the residential context among elderly people using GPS data collected through their smartphones. And then one very interesting study done by Suji, she handed out smartphones to people recently released from prison in the US in order to study their how they reintegrate into everyday life. And she accessed social contacts, like the number of contacts in the phone book, geographic contacts, like inferred from GPS location, emotional well-being for job search and employment. So a lot of information can be accessed from phones and can be used to answer substantive questions. Okay, now talking about how we can get the data, how the data looks, I now want to talk about some empirical applications, and I will start with a paper that colleagues from the University of Mannheim and elsewhere and me, we recently published in Social Science Computer Review, and we wanted to know how well can we predict voting behavior using digital trace data, and digital trace data here I mean weblog records and smartphone usage. And so we didn't want to just make this like a proof of concept that it works or something like that, like we publish in a computer science journal that we can, with accuracy of say XYZ, we can predict these attributes, but we wanted to embed this more in a traditional like social science framework. And so we thought, well, the problem is when we want to infer like information like voting behavior, then these records are sensitive records. So under the GDPR and under privacy law and regulations, voting behavior in Germany and political preferences are considered personal sensitive information. And we know that when we go on the web, companies through cookies, through browser fingerprinting, kind of they try to record our steps when we navigate through the web in order, say, to tailor search results or to tailor ads and to target certain groups or certain people who show certain behaviors. And so there is growing concern that these companies who predict, like if we are say, old or young, or if you're male or female, or if you're interested in buying products for children or not, that they could also train algorithms that predict these personal sensitive information. And there's some evidence that even it's not allowed, this is done on the web. And so we wanted to know, well, how well does it work? Because you can't find a lot of information. It's like black box, it's algorithms that belong to firms, to companies, and they tell us, well, certainly we can target these people, but nobody has an idea how well it works. And so we wanted to know, does it work? Can algorithms be trained to predict personal sensitive information? And as an example, we chose voting behavior and political preferences. And we wanted to know if in a kind of real world scenario where companies track our browsing behavior when we go online, can they infer our political views? And how well does it work? And from like a social science background, there's some reason to believe that what we do on the web is predictive of our political preferences. Like you've all heard the terms like echo chambers, selective exposure, filter bubbles. So basically that people who go online, they have certain preferences. They only read what serves to their personal political preferences. So there's some reason to believe that if we can observe what people do online, what news they read, that we can infer their political preferences. And so we use data from one of these non-probability samples, about 2,000 members, online behavior from desktop PCs and mobile devices, URLs visited, date duration, apps used, date duration, and the data was collected before and after the federal election in Germany in 2017. And in addition, we have survey data. Participants were asked shortly before and shortly after the election whether they intend to vote in the election, whether they already know which party they want to vote for, and after the election whether they voted and for which party they voted. And so in addition, we have social demographic information. And so what we wanted to know is, can we, using only the digital trace data and the web data, can we predict whether somebody is undecided who to vote for, whether they actually voted in the election, and whether they voted for the AfD, the right-wing populist party in Germany, or for the Greens, the more left-wing Green party in Germany. And we chose these because they kind of represent the two extrema, but also very popular extrema of the political spectrum in Germany. And so we derived from the URL data, we derived a set of predictors. And the first, we organized them in different blocks. The first are general usage patterns. So when do people go online? How long? When do they use their phone? How long? During nights, during days, and like people who use it a lot, people who use it less. And then the second block are domains visited and apps used. And by domains visited, I mean that we kind of cut off everything that we found in the URLs that came after the first, the domain. So bild.de is the domain, and everything that follows, like if they visited a specific article, we cut off and only focus on like how much time did they spend on bild.de, how much time did they spend on Google, how much time did they spend on Amazon. And overall, we derived a set of about 10,000 predictors. And in the third block, we paid special attention to news media consumption, because we thought, well, political behaviors and preferences likely can be best predicted if we put special focus on those domains that come from the news media and public service broadcasting. Because if somebody reads a lot of information about politics in the news media, then likely this person is politically very interested. maybe it can also tell us something about their political preferences, like whether they lean more towards the left if they read a lot of Taz, for example, or more towards the right if they read, I don't know, Bild and Welt. And we also manually collected a list of alternative non-mainstream media, so some of these right-wing blogs and like Russia Today, but also where individuals blog about some, I don't know, deep state and other conspirational theories, because we thought, well, maybe these tell us a lot about those people who have these very extremist views. And as benchmarks, because we wanted to demonstrate, we wanted to compare our results to other studies in order to demonstrate that our results kind of fit into the existing literature. We also predicted social demographic characteristics, because that is what we see in some of the literature, that people use weblogs to predict age, income, gender, education. And as a second step, we also predict voting just using social demographic variables. So if we had only social demographic variables, how well could we do? And how well can we do when we combine them with these weblogs? And how well do we do when we only use weblogs? And then we trained a series of machine learning models relying on the XGBoost algorithm. And then we did kind of this standard machine learning steps, like we split into training data, into test data. We train using cross-validation, and we implemented a grid search to find the optimal set of parameters. And the biggest challenge here is that we have way more predictors than we have observations. I mean, this is what machine learning methods are used for, but it was a challenge because we have a lot of sparsity in our data. So we only limited it to domains that were visited like at least 10 minutes by at least 20 different people, but still we had so much information which was only, say, for 20 people, they visited the domain, and the rest, they never visited it. So we have a big problem with, or challenge, sparsity of the data and class imbalance. If you want to predict whether somebody voted for the AfD and you only have 15% AfD vote share, then you have a huge imbalance. All right, and then here I printed out some of the results. And when we look at undecided, for example, here we have ROC AUCs. The higher, the better, with a maximum of 1. We see it's kind of, it varies around 0.6. If we use only social demographic information, we get 0.6. And if we use only tracking information, so only digital trace data, we get a similar value. If we include some if you combine demographics and trends in general, it increases a little, but when we include all the information, it even decreases. So there's some problem or some trade-off. Increasing the number of predictors kind of reduces our predictive performance, and overall, like these values, 0.6 isn't really good. And when we look at the question whether somebody voted, well, they kind of get a little bit larger, but they still are far away from kind of being almost deterministic. And the same for when we look at which parties they voted for, it also sends us around 0.6, a little bit more for the Greens, sometimes goes up to 0.7, but overall we can't really predict political preferences and voting behavior. And because we wondered, well, is it because our models are just not that good, or is it because the data doesn't allow it, or like it just isn't in the data? We have these benchmark results where we predict social demographic information just to see if our results fit or kind of match those of other studies. And here we get values of up to almost 0.9, and basically these values align very well with what we've seen in the previous literature, where people predict social demographic information from web blogs. Then just as a summary, so when we use social demographic information, yeah.
So could you like use, because you also predicted social demographic information,
yeah.
could you use that in the second step then to predict voting?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we could do that, but because we had social demographic information from the survey data, we actually chose to use those because we thought, well, they don't have this kind of loss in precision because they are only predicted, but they should be rather of higher quality.
But in principle, like maybe it could improve, or I'm not sure, but
I don't know. I mean, basically, like the predictions are just a function of the data, and then kind of you use the predictions as another predictor, so it's just a more complex function in the end. So it would be interesting to see if we say, well, we only have these web blogs, which is what we see in the real world when companies target specific groups based on their behavior. That would be interesting to see how that changes.
simple question.
Yeah.
Considering these rough ASC curves, values, because I don't know how to plot it, is this a percentage? How many predictions you make?
No,
But
no.
at the end, it's about the binary indicator.
Yeah, yeah. So a very simple interpretation would be if you have a value of 0.5, it's just as flipping a coin and deciding, well, without knowing anything, I just decide, well, this is 1 and this is 0. And if you have 1, then you can perfectly predict for everybody the true value. And anything between 0.5 and 1 is, well, anything larger than 0.5 is better than random guessing. But you can't really interpret them as percentages. But you can also calculate like how many people were correctly predicted. But those numbers are a little bit influenced by the class imbalance, because if you have, say, 90% ones and 10% zeros, then just predicting ones for all of them would already result in 90% being correctly predicted. So we chose these ROC AUCs and also like F1 scores and to get a better idea of how well our algorithms work. But basically, anything larger than 0.5 is better than random guessing. And good would be probably something like, there's no real rule of thumb, but say 0.9 would be really good. So similar performance when we just use social demographic data, and hardly gains in performance when we combine the two, likely due to the fact that we have so many predictors. So in the future, maybe we need to kind of even reduce the numbers, the number of predictors even further, just to see if we can improve our models. And so as a summary of the study, well, we do not find that we can really accurately predict political preferences and voting behavior. So likely if companies predict those, or like Cambridge Analytica claiming they target and micro-target specific people, likely those claims are a little bit over the top. And I read in one statement, one interview, that somebody said like companies like Cambridge Analytica are better marketing companies than actual analytical companies. And so public debates of big data, micro-targeting in political campaigns and so on, and social media's impact on democracy may actually overestimate what big data can and cannot do. So we believe, because our results for the benchmark models kind of align well with previous research, that those claims are a little bit overrated, and maybe this is also an indication that these online societies are not as fragmented as as many feared. So is privacy at stake? Like, do we need to worry that companies predict our personal sensitive information? Well, it's difficult to say. If they do it and it's inaccurate, well, is it better if somebody predicts for me that I'm a diehard left-wing socialist communist? I don't know. And there's some finding that users worry at least as much about inaccurate information being inferred about them than sensitive information being made or being disclosed. So yeah, overall, we do not find that this works very well. Yeah, then currently we are working on a extension. So we only use the domain data. That is, we only use Bild.de, Süddeutsche.de, or like CNN.com, Fox.com, but we didn't use the actual content consumed on the website. And because from the URLs, we can see which articles people read. So we could try to infer about which topics they read a lot. And we are currently updating our models with some additional information that focuses on the content of news websites. This is with a new data set that covers the European elections in May earlier this year. Our traditional model doesn't do very well. It's hardly better than random guessing because we don't have so much data, but it might also be because the European elections are just not as important to people as like the federal national elections. But what we definitely see is this green line here. Those predictions were made based on social demographics combined with clusters of content consumed by people. So we use this BERT algorithm that was developed by some Google researchers last year to kind of infer what people read about which topics, and then we calculated how much they read about specific topics and so on. And so there seems to be some huge increases, and when we use that with the more with the data for the German federal election, we are hoping that maybe we can get even better predictions, which would then, however, kind of be difficult in terms of, well, can you train models to predict sensitive information? Maybe. Okay. To talk about some more empirical applications, which may speak to those of you who are interested in mainly political science, political communication. Yeah.
Just one question. So I understand that maybe in the web blogs you have that much information, but if you go to a platform like Facebook, you have all the likes, maybe comments, the social network, and so on. I mean, they are probably much better at predicting what they.
So there's one interesting study by the Pew Research Center in the US. They kind of took a different approach. They asked people to go to their Facebook settings and check which political characteristics Facebook inferred about them. And then they asked them to report them in the survey to get an idea how well do these algorithms that Facebook uses to target people work. And what they found was that I think only about 70 to 75% of people were correctly classified, even in the more, I'd say, in the more simple case of Democrats versus Republicans and not the multi-party system as in Germany, that Facebook doesn't do so well. So we also thought, well, if you have more data, if you have data like Google, you have all the location data from Google Maps and everything from search engines and from all the Google products, that you could get better results. But from Facebook, we see it doesn't seem, and I really say seem, to work as well. Okay, are there more questions? Because if not, I will talk a little bit more about other empirical applications. Okay, so one study which was, I think, in 2016, published in POQ, Public Opinion Quarterly, they wanted to study filter bubbles, echo chambers, and online news consumption. And I will here more talk about their methodology to give you an idea how that can work in research projects, and not so much about the results. So these researchers collected 50,000 web logs from 50,000 users based in the US, with the important restriction: only users who regularly read online news. So they kind of narrowed their sample down to those who are, say, interested in news, probably also interested in politics. So if you have such a sample, then maybe it works even better than if you have a sample that includes all those people who don't really care about politics, daily news, and so on. They collected data through the Bing toolbar. So like in browsers, you have the Bing search toolbar. Some people have that installed. And because some of the researchers work at Microsoft Research, they had access to the data. And what they had was URLs opened in a browser and geolocation inferred from the IP address. And then they trained different algorithms. The first step was they only restricted web logs to URLs that were related to news articles on 100 of the most popular news outlets in the US. And then they trained an algorithm to identify those stories out of all the news stories that had political opinions, because they wanted to know how much do people like only read what serves and tenders to their own political views. And so they trained an algorithm to identify those that are opinion pieces, and then assigned also political slant scores to media, to these different media, by identifying the share of readers in a region that where usually readers consume those news, and then kind of deriving a score from the share of Republicans versus Democrats. And what they found was that especially articles found by social media and web search engines rate higher on ideological segregation than those found by directly visiting news sites. So what does it mean? Articles found via social media. Well, if you observe sequences of weblogs, then say you have an entry which is facebook.com, immediately followed by a URL which points to a specific article, not to bild.de, but to bild.de/politics/foreign/from something, then it's safe to assume that somebody clicked on the link because they found it on Facebook and then were directed to the news articles. So it's safe to assume that those URLs which immediately follow a referrer like Facebook and then point to a full URL, that those were found through social media. And the same with web search engines. And what they found was, as I just mentioned, that if you get your news via social media, then there's more ideological segregation. What they also found was that these channels are also associated with greater exposure to opposing perspectives. So it's not that you only get those news that kind of support your own worldviews, but you also get those that are opposing. And overall, the majority of online news consumption mimicked traditional offline reading. So most of the content was not visited through social media or search engines, but by directly going to news websites and then clicking on articles. And to show some more studies, which also mainly deal with news media, Möller et al., they studied news media usage and political opinions in the Netherlands, and they also wanted to see like how people arrive at their news content through different channels like social media, search engines, or directly going to newspaper websites. And Peterson et al., they used data from the US collected by the YouGov panel to measure partisan polarization in political news. So mainly if the readership of or viewership of Fox News is mainly Democrats, Republicans, or if it's mixed. Then Masha Krupenkin, who collaborates with us on a project, she used in some of her previous research also Bing search data, so in weblogs gathered through this Bing search tools bar to study the effect whether the election of Donald Trump had effects on people's mental health. And she found that Spanish-speaking Latinos had clear, significant, and sustained increases in searches for depression, anxiety therapy, and antidepressant medication as a result of the election of Trump. And then I mentioned this earlier, Steven Davidovitz, he was kind of one of the first guys to do this search, query-based research. He uses Google search data and finds that the percent of Google searches that include racially charged language, like nigger, for example, that relates to the vote shares in counties for Obama or his opponent. And finally, an ongoing project where Alexander Wenz, who's also here in the room, and I are currently working on. So we thought, well, today a lot of people, if they experience some problems with their health, they go online, they look up information, like they Google, okay, I sprained my ankle, or I have a weirdly looking dot on my skin, or I have pain in my hip. And so usually what people do, one of the first things is they go online and they Google for their symptoms. And there's a lot of interesting research, like some people call it cyberchondria, because they found that when people Google for very everyday symptoms, they easily arrive at very dangerous but very rare diseases. So you Google for something like you have pain in your right hip, and then you arrive after 10 minutes at information that tells you that you will die in a year. And probably this is completely bullshit. And so we wanted to know what kind of health-related information do people get from the internet, and what kind of health-related apps do they use. And we had survey data that informed us about social demographic background, but also about medical conditions. So whether people have like diabetes, asthma, issues with blood pressure, heart problems with their heart, but also if they regularly exercise, if they smoke. So we kind of can combine all that information. And one interesting thing where we think this could be used is such data probably allows us to study like how do these anti-vaccination movements, for example, how do they originate, like who is most susceptible to get information about this anti-vaxxer movement, how do they get it, and how does it evolve over time? And I think such questions we cannot answer with traditional survey data, for example. But if we can observe what people do online, and I guess a lot of information about such things like anti-vaccination stems from online sources, then we can try to kind of follow the paths how that developed. And just some examples. So we categorized apps into different categories, and for example, we find that a lot of apps are actually associated with health tracking. So like on iOS, I think you have this health app, and people, when they use their Fitbits and Jawbones, then a lot of information is about these apps. Some information about sexual health, very important, women's health, like period trackers, for example. And there's actually some like recently there were some studies, some findings that showed that a lot of these, especially women's health and other sexual health issues and websites and apps, they send data to Facebook. So there's a lot of privacy concerns here, and like I imagine you could easily train a model that tells you when a woman has a period or not, just by observing when she uses her period tracker or not. And so this is really important, because you probably don't want people knowing when you have your period, or like if you use apps that tell you when to take your contraceptives, or when like you measure your temperature, when you have to use protection or not. You probably don't want companies and other people to be able to observe such very sensitive information. And another thing that we result from that study is we looked at what are the most common terms that people search for when they search for health information. And a lot of it seems that a lot of terms are related to pregnancy. So we see pregnancy, children, baby. So especially when women are pregnant, they tend to seek a lot of information online. A lot of people simply seem to be looking for a pharmacy, and then something like symptoms of diseases when they have pain. And overall, I mean, this is very basic. So this is just the most frequent unique words, and you can dive much deeper. But just to demonstrate that we can really learn a lot from such data. Okay, some future projects, and then I will be done. Some ideas we had, and some ideas we've seen elsewhere. For example, from an economic perspective, if you know that people are working and you can observe what they do on their phones, it would be super interesting to see, like, when they are supposed to be working, what do they do on their phones, and like what is the economic impact of using gaming on your phone while you're supposed to be working, just as a random thought. And then do trajectories of news consumption explain support for populist parties and opinions. That's a project we're currently working on. So like whether getting your news, as I explained earlier, from social media versus going to news sites directly is associated with support for populist parties. Then we have data for the EU elections earlier this year. And so one topic we were interested in is, so EU elections should be about EU topics, but well, from observing the debates in different countries, we see that many of the topics that were very important in these in the campaigns were rather focused on a national context and not so much on the EU context. So EU elections should be about EU topics, but they seem to be only about national topics. And yeah, that's it from my side. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer them now. Also, we have, as I said, data for two different points in time, one for the German federal election, one for the EU elections in Germany, France, and the UK. If you have ideas, feel free to contact us. We are super interested, especially when it comes to substantive questions, and we are happy to think about new ideas. And otherwise, I hope that I could demonstrate how you can use some rather recent forms of digital trace data for social research. And thank you very much.